Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Dr. Lewis V. Baldwin. Dr. Baldwin is in the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University, and of course, Dr. Baldwin, we've introduced you on so many occasions,
That's
and
right.
I think this is the first time we ever introduce you as being from Tennessee State University. Of course, I think that we all understand that you're at Vanderbilt University and have been for the last almost 20 years or so.
Right.
Let's have you, Dr. Baldwin, to talk about your background and other information, and so that those individuals who might not know you, and I can't imagine there being too many people who might not know you from this particular show, but to give us some information about your background, your education, and then we'll get into the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Okay. I was born in Camden, Alabama in the late 40s, and I attended the public schools in Camden, Alabama, Wilcox County, the so-called Alabama Black Belt, and I finished high school in 1967, matriculated at Talladega College, Talladega, Alabama, and I received a degree in history from Talladega in 1971. From that point, I went to Crozar Theological Seminary, and I was there from 71 to 75, receiving both the Master of Theology degree and the Master of Arts degree in Black Church History. And in 1980, I graduated from Northwestern with a PhD in the History of Religions. But going back to my high school days, I had an opportunity to participate in some of the activities in the South, some of the sit-ins and demonstrations, and also to observe a lot. And over the last 20 years, I've been writing a lot about the civil rights movement and about the connections between what happened in the protests in the South and what happened in terms of the development of civil rights legislation.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we also know that you one of the preeminent Martin Luther King scholars, and since Dr. King played such a crucial role in the civil rights movement, we would expect you to bring in, that kind of information in dealing with this Civil Rights Act of 1964. But let's see, Dr. Baldwin, if we might be able, during this first segment, to simply have you to make some preliminary statements in reference to the significance of this act, and then we'll use the other time to talk about specifics in reference to it.
I think the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most sweeping and the most comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation introduced up to that point. You had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which established the citizenship of all Americans, irrespective of race and color and creed. 1875, you had another Civil Rights Act, which of course dealt with discrimination in public accommodations, inns, theaters, etc. 1957, there was a Civil Rights Act that sort of created the first Civil Rights Commission. In 1960, you had a Civil Rights Act that sort of dealt with the issue of discrimination in housing and bus segregation. But of course, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was quite different in the sense that it was much more comprehensive, much more sweeping in scope, dealing not only with voting, but dealing with public accommodations, public facilities, education, employment opportunities. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act also enhanced the powers of the Civil Rights Commission that had been created earlier, and also created the Equal Opportunity Commission. So you're talking about a much more comprehensive bill when you talk about the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, you talked about all of these Civil Rights Acts, and I think one question has to be, why couldn't we get it straight? It seems to me that we started in 1866, and as late as 1964, we are still trying to get it straight. I mean, what seemed to have been the problem in terms of dealing with civil rights in this country?
I think the major problem has been the lack of implementation, and also the lack of resources to make sure that the guidelines of these bills are implemented once they are introduced and passed. So I think that has been our major problem, the lack of implementation, also the failure to provide the kind of resources needed to make sure that the provisions of these Civil Rights Acts are really translated into into daily public life.
And so in a real sense, you think that the Act in 1964, as we will talk about when we come back following our first commercial break, that the Act of 1964 really is the most comprehensive
That's right,
act
by
of all of
far.
those other acts passed.
Of all civil rights legislation passed in history up to that point.
Up to that point,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And of course, let us make preparation for this first commercial break, and then we'll get back and we'll talk specifically about the Act in 1964. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is the Civil Rights Act.